This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
We've got from the offices of the the offices of the Information and Privacy Commissioners of Canada, Monsieur Philippe Dufresne, who is the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, as well as Isabelle Gervais, who is the Deputy Commissioner Compliance.
I just want to, we had a little bit of confusion around the timeline when we had CRA officials here. So if I understand you correctly, can you just confirm when were you made aware of the breach, the number of breaches dating back to 2020? Was that May 9th? Is that correct?
That's when we received the formal notification of those breaches. And the policy, the Treasury Board policy, requires that a notification be given to my office formally within 7 days of the organization being made aware of it. In this case, clearly this didn't happen because some of those incidents dated back to 2020.
And so after there was obviously a large time delay between, and CRA officials had acknowledged that they were aware of these breaches, and in fact, testimony suggests that for many of these breaches, the minister is made aware of these breaches, that they were not reported in a timely fashion. Even after that, did I hear you right? In October, they've petitioned the Treasury Board to actually not report breaches on the 7-day period. They actually want more time on a quarterly basis?
For some of them, they've identified that this was operationally challenging for them to do that. They've requested this exception, and as indicated, I was prepared to support it with some conditions. The 3-month, 7-day may not make as big a difference. But the 7-day, 3 years that we're talking about in this instance, that's the major concern. And again, if for specific operational reasons for a specific amount of time, that's a different question. But the concern that we see, and we saw it, in fact, even in this earlier investigation of the GC key that we reported on in February, even then we had some concerns about being notified in time, getting responses in time. So it's a concern, not just for CRA, and that's why it should be a legal obligation.
That's very good advice. Do you think that there's an accountability issue within the department about who maybe owns the reporting and accountability requirements within CRA? I'm just trying to understand how, on one hand, a department would acknowledge, yes, we knew that these things were happening in real time, but failed to properly notify or follow the rules that had been set out.
Right. Well, I mean, I think what we hear is that there's a focus from the departments to notify the individuals, and that's a good thing. That's important, and you need to contain the breach. I don't know the reasons why we're not notified formally within the deadline, but what I know is that it's a concern. If we're not notified in time, we can't provide advice and guidance in time, and that elevates the risk for Canadians. And so I also know that if something is required by law, there's a greater likelihood that it's going to be complied with than it's required merely in policy or directive.
And as part of your investigation, will you be looking at the activities that gave rise to the breach? We've heard some conflicting reports about whether it's a third party, whether it may have been on the departmental side. Is that something you'll be exploring?
Well, we want to understand what happened. We want to understand whether the measures were sufficient. So we need to have the context. If there are some third parties that are involved in this situation, then we're going to look at that. If it raises questions under private sector or public sector privacy law, then we'll address that and see whether we need to amend the scope of the complaint. But our position is that the government, if the government is contracting with third parties from the private sector, the government has an obligation to make sure that its third party partners are providing adequate protection.
Right. And what obligation would, say, the department have to notify the public generally about potential breaches or risks to their own, if it's from one particular third party or some kind of similar instances? In this case, the public was not notified at all. I acknowledge that some individuals were contacted, but the general public was not made aware either.
Right. Right. Well, and there's really the three categories, right? You notify the individuals because you need to protect them. You need to make sure that they can protect themselves. You need to notify the regulator, my office. You need to notify Treasury Board and others. But the question of notifying the public then becomes a question of trust. How do you make sure that the public isn't learning of this from the media? That the individuals may also be learning of this from the media. And in fact, I think this was discussed in earlier testimony. There's also a taxpayer's ombudsperson. There's also a taxpayer's charter. And one of the principles in there is also that taxpayers be notified promptly if there's fraud schemes and so on. Again, for the reasons that this is just important for trust, and it's important to manage the stress level of individuals.
And do you feel empowered? Does your office have the right authorities to make recommendations on internal processes, accountabilities, but also, I recognize this Treasury Board exemption. I'll call it an exemption. But if you've just gone through a very difficult period where you've not reported, I find it a bit hard to imagine that the answer to that is giving the entity more time to report. You'd think it'd actually be the other way around. No, you're on remedial actions and you need to report more frequently. I think that would make a little bit of sense.
Right. Although I think there's something to be said about acknowledging a challenge meeting and meeting a requirement and explaining why and seeking an exception, I think is better than breaching it and not doing anything and not saying anything about it. So I think that's an important element. But to your question, yes, our investigation will look at that. We'll make some recommendations, as we did in the earlier investigation. And our earlier recommendation included improvements on communication, accountability. We had found in that earlier case that there was departments pointing fingers at each other and saying, it's not us, it's this department, it's that department. And we found that was an issue and had to be corrected.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chambers. Mr. Dufresne, going to go to Ms. Shanahan now.
Correct me. What are the different types of breach of privacy data breaches that we can see, and what do they look like? And refer to the one at CRA.
Well, we can see different situations where one could be employee snooping. Someone's looking at information that's not it's not theirs, and they're not entitled to it, and there's not enough security about that. You can see what we had in the investigation, which was credential stuffing, which is someone finds out your password, and you're using that same password on many accounts and many devices.
Would they have found it out from the CRA, or would they have found it out from the innocent citizens somehow?
Oh, it could be a number of factors. You could have a situation where they would find it from individuals, from third-party vendors, from other sources, and then that's reused.
Not from the CRA. I mean, especially when we look at what this incident is right now. Was it the CRA that somehow divulged people's passwords to bad actors? Is that what we're
that's not what it seems at this stage. We're going to be investigating and reaching our conclusion, but it's a situation where it appears to be passwords that were obtained elsewhere and then being used to gain access to some of the devices.
The concerns that I actually have are on your delay to adequately inform Parliament. So what rationale do you have for deferring the inclusion of the 31,468 material privacy breaches until the next reporting period?
So we were informed of half of those 30,000. So we were informed of 15,000 of them at the end of our investigation into the GC key matter. And we presented a special report to Parliament on this matter in February 2024. So those 15,000 were made public, were included in that report. And that report was included in our annual report to Parliament. What we did not include is the fact of having received the formal notification of this by the department, because we had not received the formal notification of this in the fiscal year. And so that formal notification notice happened after the period that we're reporting on in our annual report. So that's why that number was not in those statistics.
Given the scale of these breaches, why was there no effort made to provide an interim or supplementary report to Parliament?
Well, we included our special report to Parliament in our annual report, so that the information of this major investigation on the CRA, including the fact that there were these 15,000 additional breaches that we had been notified late on was part of our annual report, but the updated information that we then received after the end of that period was not included because it was not in that fiscal year.
But why not then provide an additional adequate report? Would you not agree that 15,000 material privacy breaches are in fact material to the accountability of Parliament?
Right. Well, the annual report was filed in Parliament in June. Parliament rose, and then we were into September, and we were finding out more about the situation. And then, of course, we received the complaint in October, and we announced that complaint immediately.
I guess, from my perspective on this committee, I've worked with you alongside you for quite a many years now, and I am concerned that we don't, as opposition members, at least have timely information. So you referenced, I believe in your opening statements, that given the significance of these risks and potential impacts that they can have on individuals, that timely breach reporting requirements need to be made as a legal obligation under the Privacy Act, rather than a Treasury Board Secretariat policy requirement. Would you not agree that the same duty of candor and legal requirement as a reporting mechanism to this particular committee would help to make sure that these significant issues are communicated promptly?
Well, certainly I agree, and we're going to be looking at how we can improve on this. But certainly this was reported to Parliament in June. We were finding out more about the situation subsequently, and a month or so after the House returned, we announced the launch of our investigation on this. But certainly, we'll be reflecting on that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I would put to you that we can only deal with the information we have. The governing side has the information, opposition does not, and we look to you as an arm's length arbitrator of this type of oversight, working in partnership with this committee to help provide oversight. So when could we expect moving forward that you would be able to provide recommendations or some kind of reflection or learning from that gap in reporting that occurred between the knowledge of the breaches, the what you called fiscal cycle, the lack of interim report, and then, of course, your annual reporting? Well,
certainly, I think this will be part of the report that we issue in our investigation in this matter, because we do, as we did in the previous GCK report, talk about when we were notified, the circumstances, when the complaint was launched.
Let me ask you a more direct question, just for the benefit of this, because we might be ahead of you on this, given that we're doing this study right now. What 3 reflections can you offer this committee to ensure to us, as recommendations for the study that we're doing right now, that timely reporting will come to this committee that will give us the ability to have, full information on these types of material privacy breaches?
Well, I think the early reflections are looking back at the GCK investigation in 2020. It was made public by the Treasury Board. And so the government department made it public, and then we launched an investigation after that. I think that's probably the preferred solution at this stage, but certainly we'll be reflecting on how this can be done in the optimal way with the government departments and my office with this committee. As I say, we issue annual reports, we issue special reports to Parliament from time to time. We'll look at all of those tools and mechanisms, but I think early thoughts would be that this should be something that the affected department makes public to Canadians.
Would you agree that the delays do affect our ability to provide parliamentary oversight, timely parliamentary oversight?
Well, I think any delay has an impact on any oversight. So certainly, the earlier the information is made available, the better.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Green. That concludes our first round. We're going to go to our second round, 5 minutes, and I'm going to go to Mr. Caputo. Go ahead, Mr. Caputo, for 5.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I appreciate the two of you being here today for a couple of hours to answer the questions. I'm relatively new to the committee, so I don't have the knowledge that some of my colleagues do. So I'll launch into a few questions, but forgive me if I'm asking some background questions to acquaint myself. Now, The minister appeared here, and I think it was mid to late November, November 18th or 21st. And what struck me from the minister's, well, first off, you saw the minister's testimony, is that correct?
Yes.
Was there anything you disagreed with when you saw the minister's testimony?
Well, as I say, my position is that my office should be notified within 7 days of those events, unless there's an exception that's granted. So that's a key point that I would say. I haven't heard that. I don't know if that's a disagreement, but this is something that I would want to see as a legal obligation.
As in, the minister should be taking action to do her job and notify you when there are these pretty significant breaches.
Well, I think all departments. I think that's certainly my position, that this should be done, should be a legal obligation, and that will allow us to provide input earlier and better.
Well, the reality is that when there's a privacy breach, it shouldn't take a law to require a minister to tell the privacy commissioner that something bad happened. We can agree on that, certainly.
Well, I would hope, but the experience shows otherwise. The experience shows that we are not given these formal notifications within a 7-day time.
What I found disappointing, what I do find disappointing, Commissioner, is that my impression from the minister's testimony was, we did everything we could, nothing to see here. This is on someone else or something else. Would you agree with that assessment of how she, would you agree that that is how the minister was portraying things?
Well, I think that the testimony will stand for itself. But what I am saying is that I understand departments have lots of pressure, but these notifications are important. And if it were a legal obligation in the Privacy Act with a timeline, I think we would see greater compliance in those notifications.
Now, as I understand it, Minister, in your report of findings, you made several recommendations which CRA has agreed to implement. Now, was CRA using best practices at the time to prevent these sorts of privacy breaches?
Well, that was one of the substantive issues in the investigation. So they took the position that they were. Ultimately, we found that the practices were not sufficient. And we discussed this in our special report, talking about some of the advice that had been started to be made, some of the concerns that were raised. Certainly, there were we didn't see situations of bad faith or anything like that, but there is a disagreement about what's the level of risk, what's the important, what are the measures that need to be put in place here. And in our report, we made recommendations to elevate those security postures.
Unfortunately, incompetence doesn't require bad faith. You don't have to deliberately try to be incompetent, but there could still be incompetence there. So I'm really interested in what you just said. CRA believed they were doing a good enough job. Am I correct in saying and I'm paraphrasing here, they weren't doing a good enough job, and part of the upshot, the corollary of the fact they weren't doing a good enough job is now we have 31,000 breaches. Is that fair to say?
Well, what we found in this, let's call it the first report, because there'll be a second report on this other situation, was that there was an under-evaluation of the significance of those breaches for individuals, and that resulted in an under-protection. And so we made comments and recommendations on that. We also found that there was information sharing gaps, accountability gaps, and so we made a number of recommendations to improve the processes.
So, I mean, again, from what I'm deducing here, and this is just my summary, is CRA and the minister thought they were doing a good job. They weren't. And at the end of the day, privacy breaches occurred. And now you have told them what they need to do to fix this, to prevent this in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Caputo. Mr. Housefather.
Has CRA now properly, it seems to me from your report, has it now properly included multi-factor authentication in all of the places that it should?
It has. I think that there's still some time for them to finalize some of the recommendations that we put in place. Ms. Gervais can correct me, but the multi-factor authentication has been put in place. So that issue is now resolved.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, just wanted to follow up on actually my colleague, Mr. Housefather, made what I thought was a reasonable recommendation with respect to comparing what happens in the United States, in particular with their tax service, the IRS, and the close coordination that they have with industry on identifying, communicating, trying to plug the holes or plug the holes in the dike, if you will. And shutting down some of these, what I'll call account takeovers or whatever, privacy breaches in general. That same kind of coordination doesn't seem to exist here. Do you think that would be in your remit to make some recommendations to government to explore the opportunities they have to work with third parties to address these issues?
I think so, and we've done recommendations in the past in terms of the public sector use of private sector service providers, and what are some of the parameters. What you're referring to is coordination, participation, partnership with those and perhaps with other organizations, and I think it's absolutely within my remit in making recommendations to say these are some of the best practices we want to see.
And would it be fair, just to help me understand, if the privacy breach that occurred with respect to these 31,000 cases, if that was a result of an individual company's policies, and they were aware of that, that company would have an obligation to report that breach to you, correct?
Private sector organizations do have an obligation
Right.
to report breaches to us.
And so just on that point, has any private sector organization made a report to you about this in particular breach?
I'll look
About
to
this-
about this
About the
private
breach at
sector.
CRA?
No.
Okay. So when the CRA says it's a third party and the company in question says we're not aware of it, and the company in question would have an obligation to report these privacy breaches, it would make sense to believe that it could be some other nefarious third party who had access to this information. Is that correct?
Well, I don't want to speculate because we're going to be investigating all of those things, and so this will be our opportunity to get to the bottom of it.
Fair enough, and we look forward to your recommendations. Do you think that we should, or do you think maybe this committee should make recommendations, or the CRA should consider changes to its performance pay and compensation structure with respect to privacy, given how great of a concern of importance it is for Canadians?
Well, I think that every tool that can improve privacy compliance is a good one. Performance management tools are good tools because they focus the minds of executives, so I would be supportive of that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. In this general scope of privacy, something I've written to your office about before, perhaps a slightly different question, but I feel it's on topic, and I haven't had a chance to speak with you. Do you think it's in the public interest, both for members of Parliament as legislatures, but also for the public, to have a full understanding of how many individuals received the private, personal, confidential details of those individuals who had their bank accounts frozen as part of the Emergencies Act invocation?
So you're asking if it's in the public interest
to find out how far and wide that information went.
Right. Well, I think that there's situations perhaps where timing would preclude that because you want the organization to safeguard the information. So there's situations where you're going to wait a little bit before making something public.
Of course,
but ultimately, as a lessons learned, I think it's something that's
good.
Yeah.
And why I'm getting at this is because the government claims that it had sent these very private details, including previous convictions, license plate numbers, to 50 individuals, however, 50 organizations. However, a couple of those organizations, in particular the Securities Commission of Ontario, the Mutual Fund Dealers Association, then went on and sent that information to upwards of thousands of individuals, but we actually don't even know how far and wide that information went. So just trying to understand, for me, it would make sense that we know the processes that led and how far or wide, and I just wanted your opinion on whether you think the public has a right to know and whether Parliament has a right to know.
I think it's important to know how far does the breach go. So how widely was this information shared? Was it appropriately done? Were there some valid reasons? Was there some valid contractual or other protections? And so those are the things that we're going to be looking at in our investigation.
So I just want to clarify, H&R Block previously said in a statement that there's no evidence that the breach came from it. The tax firm said that a comprehensive internal investigation concluded none of its data systems, software, and security had been compromised. H&R Block said it was not aware that the Canadian taxpayers impacted by the breach were any of its own clients. Do you have any information that would confirm that?
Well, I can't speak to that because we have launched an investigation, and that's what we're going to be looking into.
So you will be coming to the bottom as to where exactly the breach occurred, right?
Yes.
So, as we go through this this digital age, the nature of nefarious actions are different, and in so many ways, the more that we're public, the more that we try to find that balance between raising public awareness and battling the crimes as they're occurring and as they're changing so fast as technology changes. Where do you think that balance is in terms of public protection and public awareness?
Well, I think that it is a balance. I think organizations need to work together. I think that this is where the importance of early notification, bringing all of the key players around the table, and that includes my office, that includes the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, dealing with this with all of those different perspectives is important. And then bringing lessons learned to parliamentarians, to Canadians. There are lots of tips in terms of changing your passwords, being aware of those things. But ultimately, we want organizations to have very, very strong privacy protective mechanisms to diminish the load on individuals.
We're going to go to our reset the clock here. I am glad you brought up the issue of H&R Block, though, because that had not been brought up to this point. I'm equally glad to hear, Mr. Dufresne, that they are part of the investigation because they were implicated in this. In fact, the motion that was passed by this committee was to have H&R Block come to it to answer questions, and we've received correspondence from them, as committee members know, that they've done their own internal investigation and they found that it wasn't their issue. So I look forward to your report on this to see if at all they were involved in information of Canadians was not breached as a result of their mechanisms as well. 6 minutes. This will take us to about 5:30, so I'm going to leave it up to the committee to decide where they want to go past this point. But Mr. Barrett, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead.
In 2020, you made several recommendations to the government. Do you believe that the recommendations that you made are being followed by the government?
I do. They're not. Some of them have 12 months implementation time period, and my sense is they are on track to meet them.
Would the implementation of any of those recommendations prior to this point have prevented the breach that occurred?
We're going to be looking into that in our current investigation, so I can't speak on that.
Is it your view that privacy breaches should be immediately brought to the attention of Canadians?
Well, there are situations where you might need to keep something confidential because you want to address it, you want to contain it, you don't want the threat actors to have the information. So there is a balancing there, but certainly it's important that my office be made aware on a timely basis and that the discussion takes place about public communication to do that as soon as possible.
So in news reports on this matter, it says, and I quote, according to sources, the crisis prompted the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, to contact the Office of Revenue Minister Marie-Claude Bebeau. The agency prepared media lines to respond to inquiries should there be questions about the breach of H&R Block data and why the agency paid out millions to scammers. In the end, the public was never alerted to the scheme, end quote. So the scenario that you described, sir, was to help contain the threat, perhaps, and take action, inform your office immediately before then informing Canadians. This looks like a government not protecting Canadians, but protecting themselves from the criticism of Canadians who were the victims of potentially the government's negligence, likely the government's negligence. Do you believe that it's appropriate
no. Do you believe it's acceptable for the minister to have withheld this information from Canadians?
Well, I think that my office should have been notified earlier than it was, and I think it's beneficial for Canadians to have information as soon as possible. So there may be circumstances where it needs to be kept confidential longer, but I point to the 2020 situation where the Treasury Board had made a public announcement on this, and so Canadians were aware.
And
on the earlier situation.
Right. In this case, they didn't, and they literally just prepared a damage control plan and didn't inform Canadians whose personal information was being used for the ill-gotten financial gains of fraudsters and criminals. Isn't there an ethical, a moral obligation of the minister acting on behalf of the Crown to have informed Canadians?
Well, I think in terms of best practices, I would want to see notifications to my office, and I would want to see notifications.
And that didn't happen. So your office was not notified.
We were notified, but late. We were notified.
Quantify that.
Well, we were supposed to be notified 7 days after the department became aware, and we were notified in May 2024.
How many days later was that?
Some of those breaches dated back to 2020. So,
right.
So we're talking many days.
And continue with your answer.
And so in terms of public information, I think public information is important so that lessons can be drawn. There was a public announcement by the Treasury Board in 2020 in the GC Key matter. We investigated it. We issued our recommendation. And these are publicly available statements and conclusions that help the public debate and help conclusions being drawn. So again, subject to some confidentiality provisions, which may be legitimate for a certain time, these matters should be made public.
And the Canadians that have been defrauded would rightly lose confidence in the institution of government generally, but also in this case, in the Canada Revenue Agency, which has extraordinary powers, extraordinary access, and is, it can be the vector by which individuals end up jailed, fined, their wages can be garnished, assessed massive penalties, and this organization, this minister, opted instead to lie by omission to Canadians. Canadians were expected to believe that everything was okay because we haven't been told any different. Does it cause irreparable harm to the institution of government when this information is concealed from Canadians?
Well, what we highlighted in our earlier report is that these breaches have impacts on Canadians, and they can cause stress. You highlight the garnishment. There can be situations where people have to take steps, very distressing steps. So as much as possible has to be done for Canadians in these circumstances to inform them, notify them, protect them, and to draw lessons from that.
In my remaining time, Chair, I want to give notice of a motion. Given that, at a time when Canadians are lining up at food banks in record numbers and facing the worst cost of living crisis in a generation, Justin Trudeau's Minister of Emergency Preparedness accepted 2 taxpayer-funded VIP suite tickets to attend a Taylor Swift concert in Vancouver. The committee call on the Minister of Emergency Preparedness and PAVCO Chair Gwendolyn Point to testify before the committee for no less than 2 hours separately, and order PAVCO to provide the names of all federal ministers, officials, or staff provided with tickets to any of the Taylor Swift concerts at BC Place and any related communications.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Barrett. The motion is on notice. That concludes your time.